In this lesson, we're going to actually build our database. I already have the software installation complete. In this case, that's a requirement before you can build the database. And we're going to start the DBCA, Database Configuration Assistant, and step through this process. So there is a lot here because we're going to actually do the most manual, customized version of the install that we possibly can for learning purposes. So we'll take these steps one at a time and we'll look at each aspect as we go. So to invoke or start the DBCA from a command line, I simply type DBCA. And this starts the Database Configuration Assistant, which is Oracle's Java-based wizard to create a database. There are many ways to create a database. We could also do it manually. It can be done entirely through scripting, and that is the choice of many senior DBAs, if you will. Do it hands-on with a scripting method. But the Database Configuration Assistant has evolved a lot over time to a really useful tool. And so when you need to do a single installation of a database, then this can often be the tool of choice. So the first question we have here is, what do we actually want to do? So this looks at the installation of Oracle that's already on here and comes up with the options, highlights them, grays out other options based on what it already sees on the machine. So it gives us the option of creating a database or managing templates. When we manage templates, we're really managing a file that Oracle stores, or really the installer stores, that can have templates of databases. So we could create a database, save it as a template, and then use it later. If we had an existing database on here already, we could configure the options for it or delete it. With the features of 12c and the multi-tenant architecture, we could also manage our pluggable databases from this point. But for our purposes, we want to create the database, so we click Next. Now notice here that we're at step 2 of 5, so we're really moving along quickly. We're almost half done, right? Well, not necessarily. If we want to do the quickest, most straightforward creation of a database that accepts the defaults, we can do it that way. And we basically fill out all the information in the top and click Next, and it will pretty well do the prerequisite checks and then create the database. But for our purposes, we want to click Advanced Mode. Now notice that goes from step 2 of 5 to 2 of 13. So there's a lot of steps involved here in an advanced mode installation, but that's the one where we're going to get the greatest amount of control and learn the most about what's actually happening. So advanced mode and click Next. So we were talking about templates, and this is where templates are listed. It has a couple here by default, so we've not created any templates. It has the general purpose or transaction processing database, a custom database, or a data warehouse. So you can use these at your discretion. We can also learn a little more about them by selecting and clicking Show Details. So these are the components that would be installed during a transaction processing or general purpose database. These are initialization parameters that control the configuration of the database, character sets, data files and their location, so on and so forth. So you can learn more about these templates by clicking Show Details. For our purposes, we want to click Custom Database because we want to step through the process of doing it in a custom fashion. Click Next. Now we need to give our database a name. So we have the global database name, which is the way it appears on a network, and then what's called the SID or System Identifier. And the SID is the database name as it pertains to the database itself internally. In this case, we're going to take the standard name for a test Oracle database, if you will, which is ORCL. Notice that the SID fills in the bottom as well. This is the step where we also have the option to create this as a container database using the multi-tenant architecture. And then we can specify the number of PDBs, pluggable databases, their names, so on and so forth. But for our purposes, we'll stick with a standard Oracle database and click Next. Now at this point, we have our Enterprise Manager option. Enterprise Manager is going to be Oracle's tool for managing an Oracle database, at least from the database administration perspective. And we have a couple of options here. We can choose not to use Enterprise Manager at all. we can select Configure Enterprise Manager Database Express, which is going to be a kind of a light version of Enterprise Manager, or we could do both and register this with Enterprise Manager Cloud Control. And this would require an environment where a cloud control server, so an Oracle Enterprise Manager 12c management server, has already been set up. We'd put in the host name, the port, and an admin username and password. And when we create the database, it would automatically register with Cloud Control. In our case, we don't have any of this set up for our purposes, so we'll deselect that, but we'll leave Configure Enterprise Manager Database Express selected. Click Next. Now we have credentials, so we need to give passwords to the administrative users that Oracle includes. So those are sys and system, the highest administrative users in an Oracle database. We can give our passwords here, then give confirmation. I'm going to click down here where it says use the same administrative password. Now we're doing this for simplicity's sake. This is certainly not recommended in a true database that's going to be used by a company, particularly a production database. We're going to type in a password here, confirm the password, and it says the password does not conform to Oracle recommended standards, and then gives those standards. It's your choice how complex a password that you want to type in, but at this point, do keep track of it because we will use these passwords throughout the rest of this installation. In this lesson, we continue with the creation of an Oracle database. We've put in our password information and we click Next. Our next option is for listener selection. So we've already configured a listener called Listener running on port 1521, and that status is up. And so that's the listener that it wants to use, and we will allow it to do so and leave that selected. Click Next. Now we come to the portion where we choose a lot of the configuration parameters of how the database will be stored. So if we click this drop down, notice that we have a couple of options for storage type, either file system or automatic storage management. So ASM is Oracle's file system for databases, and that requires a separate installation of the Grid infrastructure, which is the software that's used for RAC. We can use ASM without running RAC, but it does require us to install all of that framework. So a lot of times that's not done as often as just installing it to a file system. We can use database file locations from a template, but we're going to choose use a common location for all database files, and that location will be in the Oracle base directory /Oradata. We can browse and choose somewhere else if we wish, but that will be satisfactory. We also want to click Use Oracle Managed Files. That's going to give us the option of allowing Oracle to size our database files, to allow them to automatically extend, and really manage a lot of the day-to-day aspects of data file management. So that's the database file section. Now we have the recovery-related files section, and this is something that's really new in 12c, at least this part of the DBCA process. It defines this a little more specifically than it did in previous versions of the DBCA. So again, we have storage type of either putting our recovery area on ASM or file system, which we'll leave. We do have the option of just not specifying a fast recovery area at all, but we'll leave that selected. So the fast recovery area is just a directory that Oracle defines to hold all of the recovery-related files. So backup files, image copy backup files, archive log files, all of those types of files are kept in one place for easy access and for safety. Rather than having those files spread all over the file system, it keeps them all in one place and manages them. Now we also need to specify this size for the fast recovery area. So it has it as being 4815 megabytes. So that will be adequate for us. If we did have a database that required more than that, so we did lots of backups and we wanted to keep lots of backups, we might need to increase that. Click Next. Next is the database components section, or the options that we have. If we've installed these options as a part of the Enterprise Edition, we have the option here of including all of the tables, views, indexes, all of the schema components that go along with those options. Now, what I'm going to do is deselect most of these because they're really not necessary for our purposes, and they can create a lot of clutter in the database. I'm going to go ahead and leave the JVM running here. But next, I'm going to click the sample schemas. The sample schemas make it easy to do some simple select statements. It has some basic database tables that we could play with. So they're a useful thing to have. From a security standpoint, however, we wouldn't want to put them in an actual company database because they are accounts that are known. And so that lends itself to poor security framework. But for our purposes, we want to include those. It's a bug in the installer, or the DBCA rather, that the sample schemas are not allowed to be selected. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down to this custom scripts, and we're going to actually find the script in the database installation that creates these scripts. So I'm going to click Browse. This is going to take us to the Oracle base directory. Click Product, 1210, DB Home 1. Then we want to go over to a directory called RDBMS. Then the directory admin. We want to go all the way over to find a script called UTL SAMPL, or UTL sample.sql. So that's the full directory. Click Next. Next, we have options about how we will size this in memory. So how much memory are we giving to Oracle to run this database? This is going to run by default based on a percentage of the available memory that the machine has. So this machine has about 8 gigabytes of memory. It's going to take 40% to run Oracle. I'm going to scale this back a little bit. For the purposes of a learning database, we really don't need to use quite that much memory. I like to put it around 2 gig. We have a lot of options here as far as using automatic memory management will allow Oracle to decide how memory is distributed. We also have some custom settings here where we can specify our own sizes for memory. For our purposes, we'll take kind of what the defaults have given us here for an SGA and a PGA. Next, we want to click the Sizing tab. This asks us what the size of our database block should be. We have different options here. The default is 8192, and that is good for a default. Processes is the number of processes that can run on the database. That default is good as well. Character sets, we'll use the default, but we have lots of different options for our character sets if we needed language support for other languages. Connection mode tab gives us an option for dedicated server or shared server mode. Shared server mode can be used in situations where the resources of the machine itself are pretty restricted. We'd prefer to use dedicated server mode because it has superior performance, generally speaking. In this lesson, we continue our database creation through the use of the DBCA, or Database Configuration Assistant. We've selected all of our options for initialization parameters and click Next. So now we have our options for how we want to create the database. Certainly, if we're going to create a database, we want to leave the Create Database selected. We could save it as a template and call it whatever name we wish, give it a description. And we can also click this box. This is going to generate database creation scripts. So when we create a database, there's a number of ways to do it. We can use the DBCA, but we don't have to. It can also be done entirely scripted. And so as we step through this installation, here in the last step, we can just allow Oracle to generate those creation scripts. So we'll do that so we can take a look at them. The customized storage location is going to give us the storage locations for various table spaces. So this is the system table space. We notice that the file name is OMF System Data File 1, has a size of 700 meg. And the reason it says OMF here is because we've selected Oracle Managed Files for Oracle to control the sizing and location of our data files. Here we have the individual files themselves. If for any reason we want to change their sizes, we can do so here. And we have redo logs as well. So we'll have 3 redo log groups. Click Close, then click Next. So it does the prerequisite checks and it didn't find any problems. Notice that we have kind of the history of the steps that we've gone through, and now we're on 13 of 14. And the only one that it flagged us on was database credentials. And again, that's because I put in a password that didn't meet their security standards. We can see a summary here of all the choices that we've made. Parameters, character sets, table spaces and data files, so on and so forth. And now we'll click Finish. It created the template and it generated the scripts in this location. And now it goes through the process of building the database, and this can take several minutes. While this is running, we could say a few things about the steps that it's going through. The first is to create and start the Oracle instance. So that's going to allocate the memory necessary for the database, configure all the parameters that are involved, really take all the choices that we've made in the DBCA and use them. Then it's going to create the files themselves on disk. Then it's going to build the data dictionary views. When Oracle creates the data dictionary views, it's building all of those base tables and views that Oracle uses to maintain the data dictionary. So the data dictionary pulls all of the information about the database, and we will use this frequently as a database administrator because it's the kind of sum total of knowledge about the database. So the actual creation of the database can take quite a while, even up to 20 or 30 minutes, depending on the speed of your disk. So now the steps have completed, and it gives us the information about what we've just created. So this is a good screen to maybe screenshot and save. It gives you information about where the Database Express for Enterprise Manager is, the name of the database, some things that are kind of important to keep. At this point, we can also do some password management, but for our purposes, we'll just click Exit and close. Now, the final thing that we wanted to look at was the scripts that were generated at the last step of the Oracle installation. So we instructed the DBCA to create a database, but we also said that we wanted the scripts generated. So let's take a look at those. So those were in the admin directory inside the Oracle base directory. So Oracle base, admin, ORCL, the name of our database, and then the scripts directory. All of these scripts are steps that the DBCA goes through. The DBCA is just a GUI front end to create these scripts and run them, basically. So we can also go through them and make alterations if we wish. If we want to, we can just generate the scripts themselves and do our own creation. In fact, we could create the ORCL database simply by clicking the orcl.bat. But for our purposes, I'm going to right-click on it and edit it. And this gives you some example of the command line commands that will be used during the database creation. So there's makedir commands to make all of these directories. There are these steps with this oradim.exe, and those are steps that you'll see in a Windows database creation that you'll not ever see in a Unix or Linux database creation, because these create the necessary Windows services to run Oracle. And then the last step is simply to start the SQL Plus tool and run the next script in the list, which is orcl.sql, right here. The orcl.sql sets a couple of variables. And then each one of these is just another script that it runs. So a script to create the database files, to create the database catalog, so on and so forth, down to the last step.